Using floor jacks, lift the frame slightly and place properly rated jack stands under the frame as well as the axle itself. Alleviating weight on the shackle bolts in this way will make them easier to remove. Be sure to use appropriately rated jack stands for supporting the frame as well as the axle beam. Remove tires from the axle with the affected leaf spring. Do this on both the curb side and the road side of the unit, or the axle. Once all the lug nuts are removed, set them aside for later. We'll be using these when we go to reinstall the tire after we've replaced the leaf spring. When removing the shackle bolts, use the boxed end of a wrench on the head of the bolt while using an impact driver on the nut side of the bolt. Drive out the leaf spring bolts with a mallet or hammer until they unseat from their hanger. Inspect the threaded ends of the bolts for damage to the threads. If the threads are damaged, replace the bolts. Otherwise, set the bolts and nuts aside for later installation. When removing shackle bolts, it's important to use the boxed end of the wrench on the head of the bolt and the impact driver on the nut side of the bolt to keep the bolt from getting damaged unnecessarily. Once the shackles have been removed from the leaf spring and the equalizer, inspect the shackles for any damage. If they're damaged, they'll need to be replaced. If not, set them aside for later for reinstallation. After the axle and leaf springs have been lowered from the chassis hangers and shackle links, remove the U-bolts from the affected leaf spring. Remove the nuts from the U-bolts and set aside for later. Be sure to hang on to any hardware, such as the washer and the nuts that are removed from the tie plates. Unless they are severely damaged and need to be replaced, we will be reusing them when we go to install the tie plate and the U-bolts again after the new leaf spring has been installed. Once the U-bolts have been removed, these can be discarded as new ones will be used upon reinstallation. Also remove the tie plate from the axle. And finally, the leaf spring itself. Place the new leaf spring onto the axle with the leaf spring clip pointed towards the front of the trailer. Make sure the spring center bolt engages the center hole of the tie plate. Position U-bolts and tie plate on the axle. If necessary, a hammer or mallet can be used to assist in reinserting the U-bolts up into the tie plate. This will make the process a little bit easier. Install the washers, if equipped, and hand start the nuts. Hand tighten the nuts until snug. Also, verify the following: that the center bolt is engaged in the tie plate, the leaf spring is square to the axle, the U-bolts are straight up and down and not splayed in or out, and that the U-bolts have approximately the same amount of threads sticking out of each nut. An impact can be used to tighten the nuts further, however, this is not the final stage in securing the U-bolts to the tie plate. For the final tightening, using a torque wrench, progressively tighten the tie plate nuts in a crisscross pattern until they reach their final torque spec. The torque spec is going to be dependent on the axle weight capacity. When using the torque wrench as you tighten the nuts, you're waiting to hear or feel the torque wrench click. This will ensure that the proper torque spec has been reached for each nut as you tighten them. If using new or previously used bolts, reapply grease on the shaft of the bolt itself. This would be an example of a standard shackle bolt, as you see in this video. Other options, like wet bolts, have a grease circ on the head of the bolt that would allow for grease application to be done after the bolt has been installed. On a standard bolt, a hammer can be used to seat the bolt back into the leaf spring hanger. If it's a wet bolt with a grease zerk on the end, use a socket over the head of the bolt to keep the grease zerk fitting from getting damaged. To reinstall the shackles, bolts, and nuts connecting the leaf spring to the equalizer, the axle beam may need to be moved or manipulated in order to align the holes to the appropriate spacing so that the bolts can be easily reinstalled. After applying new grease to the standard bolts, reinstall the bolts into the eyelets for both the equalizer and the leaf spring. When reinstalling the shackles, ensure that the eye bolt for the leaf spring is sitting above the bolt in the equalizer. Reinstall the nut on the threaded portion of the bolt in the leaf spring eyelet and then the equalizer eyelet. Hand tighten to start, and then using the box end of a wrench on the head of the bolt, tighten down further with an impact driver. Reinstall the previously removed tires, wheels, and lug nuts onto the axle. Start all wheel lug nuts by hand to prevent cross-threading. All this information can be found on the lci1.com website. The pattern in which the nuts are tightened are going to be opposites. This way, the tire will sit evenly and flush against the hub. The start pattern, or order in which the wheel lugs are tightened down, is going to vary depending on how many lugs are on the wheel itself. If necessary, reference the manuals at the lci1.com website in order to ensure that the proper sequence is followed upon retightening the wheel lugs onto the tire. Before completing the final torque spec tightening on the wheel lugs, we're going to lower the frame and remove the jack stands so that the tire is sitting on the ground. After the wheel lug nuts are fully hand tightened, they will need to be tightened to a proper torque spec. The torque spec will be determined by the wheel size, the stud size, and the stage in which the torque sequence is being completed in.